Okay, so again, this is mastering your qualitative methods, and we will go ahead and get started. So this slide presents both an overview of the webinar today, as well as what you should go into your methods chapter. So we'll talk about each of these sections of the methods chapter. This is kind of a compilation of what we've seen most frequently with working with doctoral students. So it's kind of a combination of what different schools require, and it's pretty comprehensive. If you don't really know where to start or what should be included in the chapter, this is a pretty good starting place. But one thing I always say, and you should keep in mind as we go through the presentation today, is that if your school provides a template or a checklist or anything like that, and it looks different from what we are presenting today, you should always defer to what they are giving you, because at the end of the day, they're going to be the ones signing off on your dissertation. So just make sure that before you start writing, you make yourself familiar with any templates or checklists that your school provides. So you'll first start off with an introduction. You'll include the research design, role of the researcher, methodology, issues of trustworthiness, and a summary at the end. So I'll touch on each of these sections and talk a little bit more specifically about what needs to go into each of them during the webinar today. So in your introduction, you want to restate the purpose of your study, and you want to do this verbatim. So you've already determined the purpose of your study in an earlier chapter. You can go ahead and just copy and paste that, whatever you've outlined in the introduction, directly into the introduction of your methods and anywhere else that you plan to restate the purpose. With the purpose of the study, just like the research questions, it's not somewhere where you want to get creative or change wording or try to rephrase it. It may start to feel redundant because you're going to be seeing the same exact wording multiple places, but this is important to do just to make sure that you're not changing the meaning or the implications of your design and your study in any way. So just make sure to copy and paste that verbatim. And then next, you'll want to preview what's upcoming in the chapter. So each of the major sections that you're going to be talking about, you'll just want to give a brief overview of what that will be. So in this section, you're sort of transitioning from the previous chapters and then looking forward and highlighting for the reader what they can expect in this chapter. In your research design section, you want to restate your research questions, again, word for word, just like the section that we just talked about. So exactly the same as you've already written them in the introduction and wherever else you have them throughout your dissertation. Here you'll be reminding the reader what your study is about and then what those research questions that you're going to address or answer using the design are. So then you'll want to identify whatever concept it is that you're studying. So maybe you're doing a case study and you are going to be defining the case or cases, and maybe you plan to use a phenomenological study. So you're going to be defining what that phenomenon is. Here you'll want to identify and define that very clearly for your reader, and then you'll want to talk about your approach. So for the purposes of this presentation, I'm guessing you're all here because you intend to do a qualitative study. Here's where you'll talk about whether or not you're doing qualitative or quantitative. And then once you do that, you'll want to demonstrate knowledge of different types of qualitative designs and really talk about the differences between qualitative and quantitative to show your reader that you understand what the structure is and why you're going to be applying it to your study. So you will be justifying why the qualitative approach is the most appropriate. So the way that I think about this is you should include a couple of paragraphs, kind of high level, just outlining why researchers would use a qualitative study. So you'll talk about what they're good for, and then you'll do the same thing for quantitative. So just again, demonstrating that knowledge. And then you'll kind of cap off that bit of the section by talking about why the qualitative is best fit for your study. And again, when you're doing this, it should be aligned to your problem and the purpose and also the research question of your study. So those should drive the design, not the other way around. There needs to be alignment across all of those things. So you wouldn't approach this process by saying, I'm going to conduct a case study and then work backwards. You should really think about what your questions are, and based on your knowledge of both qualitative and quantitative studies, determine if the qualitative is most appropriate. And then you'll do the same thing for the actual design. So to do this, I recommend presenting a couple of qualitative designs, and then again, talk about how researchers use them and in what types of studies they're useful. And then finish that off by talking about why the design that you've chosen is most appropriate. I will go over different designs during this presentation, so we'll have some time to think about that as well. So again, just really important to think about when you're doing this piece of the chapter, that you can't really demonstrate what is most appropriate without also talking about and demonstrating that you know under what circumstances different designs should be used. So here you're telling your reader and your dissertation chair that you know what you're talking about by identifying different possible research designs. So why would we use a qualitative design? Oftentimes, our research questions might be along the lines of trying to understand participants' perspectives on something, or their lived experiences and how they make meaning of those experiences. So to really get at this, then we would collect data through probably interviews, maybe some focus groups, maybe document analysis, or even observations. So those data collection methods yield textual data. So when you think qualitative, you kind of think of words. So if based on what you intend to study, based on your problem, your purpose, and your research questions, words or textual data is something that you think will answer those, then that's a good indicator that it should probably be a qualitative study. Now, the goal, unlike in quantitative studies, is that you're not, so in a quantitative study, you're typically trying to generalize the findings to a larger population. Qualitative studies differ in that your study sample is typically smaller because you're interviewing them or you're conducting focus groups. So you're not necessarily going to be hypothesis testing or quantifying your results in that type of way. So there's really no need to try to generalize, and this can be debatable, but typically with a qualitative study, that's where it's going to differ from the quantitative. So these are just things to consider when you're deciding between quantitative and qualitative, but generally the research questions are going to drive how you choose to approach your study. So there are any number of qualitative designs. This list is not exhaustive. This is what I see most commonly in students that I work with, the different designs that they're using. So I'll give a high-level overview of when these might be most appropriate. But again, keep in mind that there are other designs that you may use, should you choose to. So case studies, phenomenological studies, generic, or this is also called like a descriptive qualitative study, grounded theory, or ethnography. So we can start to describe these. So case studies are really helpful when we're looking at a specific example of something, perhaps over time. It's really an in-depth analysis of that specific case, or if you're looking at multiple case studies, it's an in-depth analysis of the cases. So I like to think of this as a really deep dive into something, looking at it from 360 degrees. So it's a very holistic look. Multiple case studies are if you have more than one case. They typically are just bounded by kind of like a uniting thread. So something that's the same or a common thread throughout each case. Case studies make use of multiple data collection methods. So you probably wouldn't only be conducting interviews. You might also pull in some document analysis, observations. These are just some other forms of data collection that you could use. They're kind of hallmarks of a case study. So this kind of makes intuitive sense because if you're really drilling down into a case and looking at it from all angles, you want different types of data to inform what you're learning about. With a case study, the outcome is generally a really rich description of that case, and you can use something like a thematic analysis to determine the themes or the patterns that emerge from the study or the case or the cases. With phenomenology, it's a little bit different. So with this, there's typically a philosophical underpinning that is deeply rooted in psychology because it has to do with lived experiences and making meaning of those experiences. So if you're exploring how people make sense of a particular phenomenon that they're experiencing, you would want to use a phenomenological study. Now, it's good to know that within this type of design, there's different types of designs as well. So this is kind of, again, a high level look at phenomenology, but you should be aware that if you choose to use this type of design, you may need to dig a little bit deeper to see what best fits your particular study. So these studies make use of in-depth interviews. We rarely see different forms of data collection included in these studies. But with this, this in-depth tactic means that you're probably spending hours with participants and perhaps conducting multiple interviews as well. The outcome of this is, again, a really rich description, but in this case, it's not of a specific case. Instead, it's of whatever the essence of the experience is, so the phenomenon. So what you're looking for are what are the common structures to this phenomenology that everyone is experiencing, so each of your participants. So here you'll be distilling the experience down to this and what we call it the essence, so kind of the core of the phenomenon. And then you'll also be talking about how people make sense of this and how they assign meaning to it. Generic qualitative designs can be helpful when your study doesn't quite fit nicely within the framework of a phenomenological study or an ethnographic study. So again, these are typically referred to as descriptive qualitative studies or general qualitative studies. There's research and there's literature that you can find using both the terminology interchangeably. So just be aware of that if you're doing a literature search. Important to note that generic doesn't mean that it's like less good or less valid. I think that there's a little bit of a stigma attached to this, but there's plenty of literature supporting the use of a specifically generic qualitative design. And I've added a citation at the bottom of this slide here. So if you do need to justify the use of this type of design, you can refer to that article there. When talking about it or proposing it. So if you're less concerned with how people make sense of an experience and you're more concerned with the experience itself, so really kind of focusing more outward and not on the psychology or the inward experience, a generic or generalized approach might be useful to you. Here, you can also use interviews, questionnaires, surveys, documents, or observations, whatever data collection technique you need to address the research question. And you have a little bit more flexibility here. So that's why it's kind of cool or like helpful because you have some room. You're not bound to a specific framework. You can kind of really pull on the data collection method that is most helpful for your particular study. Grounded theory, it's kind of uncommon. It's really sociological in nature. It's used in the social sciences. Grounded theory works a little bit differently because you wouldn't be working from a theoretical framework and you wouldn't necessarily be working from research questions. The idea here is that there's not a lot known about a specific topic. And so through data collection, and through like field work, memoing, interviewing, maybe some participant observations, you'll learn more about the topic that you're studying, and then you'll refine your ideas and your research questions based on this, and then you'll continue to collect data. So it's an iterative process, and it starts kind of in a different place. So it's not always best for novice researchers. Also, it's important to note that it is time consuming and it can also be financially consuming because there is so much time that goes into it. So it's not necessarily friendly or resource friendly for doctoral students, particularly if you're at a point where you're trying to, finish your program and kind of move on to the next chapter. This might be a more time consuming project than what you want to take on. The outcome of grounded theory is that you'll develop a theory that's rooted in your data. So an explanation of whatever's going on, whatever that concept is, the process, the action, the interaction that you develop the theory from, and what you're seeing in the data, as opposed to talking about your theory and allowing it to guide the data collection and analysis. So it just differs slightly. And again, there's some time constraints to consider when you're thinking about grounded theory. Similar ethnography, this one is less common. It's really anthropological in nature and also sociological. This one requires extended time in the field, observing participants. So again, in terms of time, it can be very time consuming, but it can be really helpful if you're trying to understand the cultural or societal context of a problem, of your research problem. So this is a holistic design in nature as well. You're going to be looking at networks of people or other institutions, groups of people, to understand all the circumstances surrounding whatever the research problem is. So with this type of study, the outcome is an in-depth account of whatever the problem is from the perspective of the participants, but also from the perspective of the researcher as sort of an insider and an outsider placed within the larger cultural context. So the process is called ethnography, and then the outcome, the written product, is also ethnography. So again, that's not an exhaustive list, but those are a few studies that you may want to consider when you're planning your dissertation. So you will have different roles within your research. So in the methods chapter, you will talk about your role in the project. If you're conducting grounded theory or an ethnographic study, your role is probably a participant observer, where you're both observing people as well as participating in the activities of daily life. But that might not be the case. Maybe you're simply an observer. Maybe you're the one who's interviewing participants, or maybe if you're really lucky, you have a research assistant to help out with that. So this is the section where you'll outline all of these specifics, whatever your situation may be. So we impact our research no matter what. And here you just need to be clear and show the reader the ways in which you're engaged in your research, because this is going to help identify any potential bias that you bring to the study. Now, that's not a negative thing. We're all humans. When you're doing qualitative research, you're going to be working with other people. So there's always potential for bias. Your research problem, of course, is something that should be established from the literature, but certainly the research that we undertake is probably also of personal interest to us as well. So we may all have blind spots when it comes to our research. So this is why you want to talk here about how you'll mitigate any influence that you have over your research and the outcomes. So that transparency is sort of what you're aiming for in this section. You'll also want to talk about anything that's specific to you. So any power differentials that might exist between you and your participants, like maybe if you're a teacher, if you're interviewing students, you'll want to talk about that here. And also address how you plan to mitigate any of the bias that can stem from that. Other ethical issues that you may want to discuss, if you're in a position of authority over potential participants, those are the kinds of things that you want to talk about. And really the emphasis is on how you plan to handle all of that to reduce bias and to mitigate any potential conflicts. In the methodology section, you'll probably have a couple of different subheadings underneath it. So your participants, your instrumentation, your procedures, all of the written procedures for recruitment, participation, data collection, and then your data analysis plan. So I will talk about these in depth. So for your participants, oops, sorry, I skipped forward. So for your participants, you want to talk about the overall population from which your sample will be drawn. So remember, the population is the large group, and then the sample is the group that you're actually including in your study. So here you'll want to talk about the overall population and then what the target group is, and then what your sample is and how you plan to sample them. So for qualitative studies, you're probably not going to be using random sampling. You'll probably be using some kind of purposeful sampling because there's a good chance that whatever it is that you're studying, you need people who fit a certain criteria. So by that nature, they're not going to be random. So you want to establish in this section what your inclusion criteria is. So define the particular characteristics that people must meet to participate in your study. So maybe they need to be 18 or over. Maybe they need to have worked at a certain organization for a certain amount of time. Do they need to have had a particular experience? Just thinking about all of these things and just really outlining what that is so that when the reader's reviewing your paper, they know exactly how you selected these participants. Next, you'll want to talk about how you'll verify that they meet that inclusion criteria. So maybe you're going to be giving out a survey, and based on that survey, you'll invite participants who meet the criteria, or maybe you're going to be phone screening participants. Whatever it may be, you'll just want to talk about that here so that there's clarity that this is the inclusion criteria, and this is how we made sure participants met that criteria and then included them in the study. You'll also want to talk about the number of participants. So how many participants do you need to recruit for the study, and the steps that you will take to identify them. So whether that's, contacting participants through email, maybe flyers, whatever it is, you'll want to talk about how you're going to be recruiting them. So just thinking of this in a linear fashion. I've identified this criteria. This is how I've identified it in my participants, and then this is how I contact my participants to enroll them in the study. Just making sure that's very clear and easy for the reader to understand. You'll also want to talk about how the sample relates to data saturation. So just talking about at what point you would, for example, maybe stop interviewing people because you don't anticipate learning more information or learning anything new after a certain point. In your instrumentation section, you want to include information about all data collection instruments. So if you're conducting a phenomenological study with interviews, then you'll have an interview protocol and you'll want to describe what that protocol is. But if you have multiple data collection techniques, then I suggest writing this section out by instrument. So maybe you'll start off with surveys, then go into focus groups, then go into observations, and then interview. So just thinking about, what's the best way to organize this so that it's easy for the reader to understand. For each data collection instrument, and again, you don't necessarily need to have multiple, but if you do, you want to talk about where it was established. So, if it's an instrument that's already been published, that's perfectly fine, but you'll want to talk about the permission that you have to use it in this section as well. And then if you're conducting any kind of document review and analysis, you would want to identify what the sources are and then how you plan to verify their accuracy. So basically, here you just want to demonstrate that the data sources are sufficient to address your research question. So I think it may be helpful sometimes to create a table where you list out your data sources and then align them with your research questions to ensure that you're getting all of the data that you need. And then in the procedures section, this is again where you want to come back and kind of list things out. Like first you're going to do this, then you'll do this, and so on. So for this one, when you're writing, I think it can be helpful to first set it out in bullets and then transform it into a narrative for the chapter. So for each of the instruments that you've talked about in the instrumentation section, you want to talk about where you'll collect the data, who you plan to collect it from, the frequency and duration of those data collection events, how many times and over how long of a period you plan to collect it, how you plan to record it, and then any contingency plans in case of loss to follow-up. So again, you're going to be working with participants. It may be that participants will schedule an interview and then, something happens, something comes up and they're not able to make it. So you just want to kind of describe the plan for what happens in those situations. So for example, if you initially said that you would recruit 12 to 15 people for your study, and then you only have 8 what are you going to do to still achieve that sample size of 12 to 15? This is where you would also include any debriefing procedures and any follow-up procedures that you plan to conduct. So if you plan to do something like member checking, it's a common method where once you've analyzed the data, you present that information to the participants and have a conversation with them about how accurate they believe the findings are. And if they think it's accurate, if they don't, and just kind of talk through that. So that's, if that's something you plan to do, you'll want to talk about it here. Another common method of follow-up is transcript verification, where once you have a transcribed interview, you send it to the participant so that they can review it for accuracy. So any procedures like that, you'll just want to pop them in this section and describe how they're going to be conducted, how you'll be following up with participants, and really just lay that out. In the data analysis plan section, you can talk about, what you're going to be doing to address your research questions. So an example could be applying thematic analysis to interview, observational, or document data. So it's not mutually exclusive or necessary, but you want to talk about how the data are connected to the research question, and then any coding procedures that you're planning to use for your data. So you will do some type of coding typically when you're using a qualitative method. To do that, you may use software to organize your qualitative data. So here you'll want to talk about that. Some different softwares that I've seen used are NVivo, MaxQDA, Deduce. So just talk about what the software is that you're using. You may also want to talk about the process of transcribing your data. So make sure you're reminding the reader that if you did interviews, they were recorded, and then how were they transcribed? Maybe you used a transcription company, maybe you transcribed them yourself, just outlining that here. There's no magic button to analyze qualitative data, unfortunately. So I do recommend, if you can, using some type of software, some type of qualitative software to help out with that. Here you can also think about discrepant cases. So if you have any participants that seem to be outliers, they don't really fit any pattern that you're seeing in the data. Here you'll describe how you plan to factor that into your data analysis and then present it with the results. Important to note that if a participant doesn't seem to fit, we don't really just throw out that data. It's still telling us something important about the experience. So it's important to keep that in and just really have a plan for how you're going to address that. We are almost to the end here. Thanks for hanging on with me, guys. So you'll also want to include a section on trustworthiness as well. There's a lot of literature out there about trustworthiness in qualitative research. So there are these 4 tenets of trustworthiness that you'll see a lot. They are credibility, transferability, dependability, and confirmability. All of these have to do with how confident you are that the findings in your study are accurate. So are they applicable to other contexts, groups, or participants? And are our findings consistent with past research? And also, are other researchers able to replicate them and conduct a similar study based on what you've done? So there are different ways to establish trustworthiness. I talked a little bit about some options. So you could use member checking or transcript verification. You could also use triangulation of data. That's also very helpful if you have multiple data sources. One important thing is that triangulation does not mean there are 3 data sources. I know it can be a little confusing. In this case, if you only have 2 data sources, like if you have a survey and an interview, that's totally fine for triangulation, but I know that the try in there kind of throws people off. Other methods you could use are an audit trail, where you sort of journal all of the steps that you're taking throughout data collection and the analysis. Typically, what I like to do in this section is have a subheading for each. So credibility, transferability, each of the 4 tenets that I've already talked about. And then what I recommend is for each of those, you talk about what it is and then how you plan to establish it in your own study. Your ethical procedures section is going to be very helpful when you're moving into the IRB. So the more information that you can pack into this section, the less work you're going to have for yourself with the IRB application. So it's very much like a 2 birds, 1 stone thing. Any agreements that you have about gaining access to your participants, your research site, your data, so that would be your school's IRB, but also if there's any other IRBs that are required for conducting a study at your school, any letters of permission that you have, they should all be included here. This is really where we're talking about treatment of human participants or human subjects. And so kind of outlining, it's basically the Belmont reports and how we plan to ethically conduct our research. So we're not harming anyone as we're doing this. There's little to minimal risk to participants for participating. And just thinking about the ethical considerations related to how we recruit our participants, how we collect their data, what we do with their data later on. So, one thing to be conscious of is making sure that the data maintains anonymity as you present the results later on. That can be kind of challenging, so that's one thing to consider. You probably won't be collecting anonymous data because you will be, to some extent meeting with your participants face to face, whether it's through an interview in person or over Zoom or, a virtual interview. So it's important to really think about how you're going to maintain their confidentiality. Are you going to redact transcripts to take out their names or any identifying information? Also, how are you going to be storing that data? So if you do choose to do a virtual interview, will the video be destroyed, for example, and then you just work and analyze the transcription or the recording, the verbal recording. So just thinking through these things and describing your plans in this section. So in summary, in the summary section, it can be kind of a throwaway section. I see sometimes people will phone it in here and kind of just be exhausted from the whole process, but you don't want to do that. So if your chair only has time to read your summary, here you'll just want to make sure you have exactly what they need to know when they're moving into your results section and into the next chapter. So you want to summarize the main points, but you want to dig a little bit deeper here. Again, you're looking back and telling the reader what you told them in the chapter. And then you also want to transition into the next chapter, which is probably going to be the results chapter. But again, think here about what are those key takeaways. If the reader could only read this, what are the things that they need to know to move forward? And then I just have some overall tips for thinking about approaching writing this chapter. I've seen that this can be really a stumbling block of a chapter. Your introduction typically goes pretty smoothly. The literature search typically does as well. And then once you get to chapter 3, it's kind of a different way of thinking about your project and of writing. So here, remember that you're not summarizing and synthesizing and critiquing literature like you have in the lit review. Here, you're really in like a planning and designing phase. So you're planning and designing, a theoretical study, right? It's a study that you haven't conducted. And I think that's where students kind of get hung up. So it may feel a little bit uncomfortable to be planning all of this out. And I see that people kind of get hung up on the what ifs. So, what if something happens and I'm not able to recruit 15 people? What if I have to conduct my interviews via Zoom instead of in person because we're in a global pandemic? These are things that are going to happen. So what you want to do is build contingencies in there, but get over the what ifs. I think a lot of this stems from feeling like you're locked into a specific place, like you have this proposal and you defend it and then it's done and that's it. And that's exactly how things have to go. But that is just not the case. So, plans change. There's always going to be a hiccup. We hope and we plan for them not to happen, but, sometimes they're unavoidable. So here you just want to build in those contingencies. So it may look a little bit different from the first two chapters that you might have written, but kind of try to overcome that urge to tend towards perfect and understand that things may happen during data collection, data analysis that are going to change your initial plan. So really you just need to think about what are the steps. So what do I need to do to collect the data to answer my research questions and to address the problem and the purpose, and know that if things change, it's going to be okay. Later on in your results chapter, you have an opportunity to describe what actually took place. So you don't have to be stuck in a box of, what you've already kind of planned. So if you feel that this is helpful, or if you feel that you could benefit from more discussion around these topics, again, we do offer full service when it comes to the dissertation, and we're here to help. So feel free to reach out to us using the links that Sierra has put in the chat. This is the end of the webinar, but I will keep it open for question and answer here at the end. And yeah, so does anybody have any questions? Thank you, Shafina. I'm glad it was helpful. And also just a reminder that we do provide a 30-minute complimentary consultation. So you can schedule that using, I think we have a link. Yes, we have a link in the chat. So feel free to use that if you'd like. It's really a good opportunity to talk about your specific project. So kind of get out of this general sense and determine what supports would be most helpful to you as you move forward, and kind of determine what type of package may be helpful. If you do have questions, feel free to pop them in the chat. Okay, let's see. I see. So I see one question, will this webinar be shared? Yes, so within 24 to 48 hours, we'll send you the recording as well as the slides. And there's a link in the chat. We also have a webinar archive library. So if you are interested in learning about other chapters, or perhaps if you're wanting to tend towards a quantitative study, we do have resources available on our website for that as well. Okay, I'll post the links in the chat again. Or Sierra, would you mind just posting those one more time? There they are. Thank you. All right, well, if nobody has questions, I won't keep you any longer. Thank you all so much for joining, and I hope you have a great day.